Here we are in Newport, Rhode Island. Beautiful Newport, Rhode Island. Founded by the English in the 1600s. And the English are still here today. How many of you have an English ancestor in your family tree? Raise your hand. About a third. Oh, about half. How many of you live in New England? That's just about everybody. How many of you live in America and speak English? Well, that's just about it, all the whole crew here. Well, if you raise your hand at all, this should be of interest to you. I claim the idea of America came from the mind of one man. He was an Englishman who lived in the 1500s. He's the man who conceived of the British Empire. In fact, he coined the term. And he's the reason why I'm speaking to you in English today. Whoa, Jim, that's quite a claim. English America, that's a lot of stuff. Well, I'll take it one step further. I also claim that he was the man who designed this 28-foot tall stone and mortar structure that still stands in Touro Park today, the Newport Tower. Whoa, Jim, you've got a lot of explaining to do. Well, let's get to it. Underneath each of these pillars is 3.5 tons of stone that goes 5 feet down to bedrock. Then you have the 8 pillars, and you've got these symmetrical arches, and the cylinder above is 2 feet thick. This baby was built to last. When the British occupied Newport in the Revolutionary War, they stored the gunpowder in there, and before they left in a hurry, they lit it. Boom! Blew the top off. That's why you don't see the top today. You see how perfectly circular it is. And before these houses were built, the tower is actually in the lower end of the picture here. These houses were built on the western side of the park. It had a beautiful view over Newport Harbor and Jamestown and the whole of Narragansett Bay. There's 5 theories about who built the tower, including the Vikings, the Portuguese, and the first governor of Rhode Island calls this his stone-built windmill. But there's reasons to suspect that it's not a windmill. All windmills built at the time were made out of wood. It was the carpenters who built them. This one's made out of stone, and it's 24 feet on the top. Well, all these windmills had a turret on the top. It had to face the blades, the blades continuously towards the wind. This, because because it's 24 feet tall, wide, would have a turret that would be too hard to move. And besides, would you put a windmill on stilts? But the main reason it's not a windmill is that it has a fireplace inside. And this fireplace, the last thing you put in a windmill is a fireplace, because one spark and the flour powder will explode. But there's 3 unusual things about this fireplace. First, it's a wall fireplace. It's built up 2 feet above the floor level. It has 2 flues, each 7 inches by 7 inches. And above it has an arch as opposed to a lintel. And on the left-hand side of the arch, right where it needs all of the support, they put that window there. Why would they jam the window right there? Well, this is my simulation of what the interior of the tower looks like, where the beams were for the first floor, because the sockets are still there, and the beams for the second floor, and where the floor is. So this is a room, and inside this room are 3 windows. There's the northeast window, which is next to the fireplace, the south window, and I'm photographing from the west window. And you can see that the south window and the west window are splayed. The sides of it go in and out, so there's a line of sight to be able to see right through the window. Well, in the early 1990s, Professor William Penhallow from the University of Rhode Island, my hero, he found these astronomical alignments in the windows of the tower. He says if you stand in the northwest corner of the park and look through those 2 windows on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, you'll see the sun. And sure enough, it appears right through the 2 windows. And it happens like clockwork. I've observed it for about 10 years now. Every year on the side here. He said there's another alignment that has to do with the moon. He calls it the lunar minor alignment. Once every 18.6 years, the moon will appear through the west window and the northeast window on an event called lunar minor. It's actually the southernmost of the northernmost risings of the moon. And he said it would happen on December 26, 1996. So I went to the tower that night, and sure enough, the full moon appeared right through the 2 windows. Now there's another alignment called the equinox alignment. And there's a North Star alignment, and there's a land north alignment. Professor Penhallow said whoever built this tower really knew their astronomy. And the idea that this was by random, the chances would be about 10,000 to 1. And he said that that interior room probably acted like a camera obscura solar disk calendar room. What's that? Well, let's take it one step at a time. I was a professional photographer, and I knew what a camera obscura was. Camera obscura means dark room in Latin. In a dark room with one small hole, the image of what's outside appears on the inside, upside down and reverse, left to right. It's what a camera is, essentially, or how your eye operates. When you're looking at me here, you're actually seeing me upside down on your retina, and your brain is flipping the image. So you're carrying camera obscuras with you today. Well, I couldn't build a camera obscura in the tower because it didn't have a top and it didn't have a roof or a floor. So I found this building nearby that had a view that the tower once had. You could see the Goat Island there in the middle of Newport Harbor, and off to the right, the Pell Bridge. And my photography assistant and I set up a seamless paper, 16 feet wide, white paper, and we blocked up the window except for one small hole. And there was the image of what was outside appearing on the interior. As you can see, everything's upside down and reversed. And we could see cars going by America's Cup Avenue. We could watch boats going across Newport Harbor. And down on the bottom part, which is where the sky is, that big round spot is the solar disk. That's the image of the sun. And as it moves across the sky during the day outside, it moves across the wall on the interior. And for over a millennium, they've been able to use the solar disk as a calendar. This is a monk by the name of Helperic, and he lived in 875 in France. And he says, put a hole on the eastern wall of your room, and every day at sunrise, mark where the solar disk is on the western wall, and you will have built a calendar. This is 1,000 years ago he was doing this stuff. But the main use was in the Renaissance, where they converted these giant cathedrals into camera obscura rooms. Way up at the summit and the roof, they would put an aperture, and down at the bottom, they would put a noon line. In other words, the hole was right in the roof, a very small metal hole in a metal plate, so it was fixed there. And the bronze line, Meridiana line, or noon line, it always runs north-south, was embedded right into the marble floor. And they watched where the sun at noon would cross this every day of the year. And by observing where it crossed on the winter solstice, the summer solstice, and on the equinox, and counting the number of days, they were able to prove to Pope Gregory XIII that the Julian calendar, which had been instituted by Julius Caesar, was out of sync from the sun by 10 days. So they took 10 days out of the year, and they put in leap years and leap days. And this is the calendar we still use today. Well, the workers weren't happy about it because they said, we got gypped out of 10 days. They went on strike. But in France, Italy, Germany, Spain, all the Catholic countries, they changed. But in England, the Queen didn't know what to do. She'd been excommunicated by the Pope. She didn't really have to listen to any papal decree. But on the same token, if she traded with France or Germany, she'd be off by 10 days. So she needed advice. Who did she turn to? Her wisest philosopher, a man by the name of John Dee, D-E-E. And he was one of her top advisors. And he says, yeah, you can tell from these camera obscura rooms we're off by 10 days. You should change it. And if you can change it first, before the papal decree takes place, you will be the woman who changed time. You will be the reformer of the civil year for the next Christian epoch. And that's to begin in 1583. Well, one day I was in the library studying this history of optics and the history of Renaissance timekeeping, as well as Rhode Island history. And I was browsing the stacks, and I came across this book called Newport Begins by Lloyd Robson, written in 1956. And in it, he lists historical names for Narragansett Bay. Well, Verrazano was sailing for the French king, and he came here in 1524, and he called this bay Refugio, a place of refuge for an entire navy, because it was a beautiful deep water port. In fact, that's why the navy's still here. The Spanish called it the Bay of Santa Baptista. And then I saw this, the John Dee Bay and River. Wait a minute. Why would this bay be named after an Englishman in 1583? That's 40 years before the Pilgrims. And the English guy who was into studying the camera obscura and the calendar reform. So I started studying John Dee. He was an astronomer. He was a mathematician. He was the navigational guide to all the great Elizabethan explorers. And he had a library of 4,000 books. You see, he studied in the Louvain in Europe and brought back these Renaissance ideas to England at the time. At the same time, Spain was becoming a superpower. And they had got all the gold from Mexico and the silver from Peru, and they had the whole Caribbean. And they had a fleet of 200 ships. England had but 20 ships. So John Dee, the top advisor to Queen Elizabeth, says to her, you know, we got to do something, or there ain't going to be no more England anymore. So he writes these 8 books to Queen Elizabeth. And in the first book, he says, first we should immediately build a royal navy of 60 to 80 large ships and hire 6,000 seamen. And then he says, in the 5th book, he says that she has a legal right to all of North America because Earlier Englishmen like Prince Madoc and John and Sebastian Cabot had been to the New World and claimed it for England. And in the last book, he coins the term the British Empire. He also includes this map. And this is a map of the Northern Hemisphere. And right in the center of it is the North Pole. And he encourages the Queen. He says, we got North America, that's where we should get our first foothold, but we also want to open up the Northeast and the Northwest Passage and be able to trade with China and Japan and become fabulously wealthy. So the front cover of his book, the 8 books that he gave to her, you'll see across the middle this banner. It says, "Send forth a sailing expedition to build a steadfast watchpost," in Greek. And then there is Queen Elizabeth guiding the ship of state. The sun, moon, and stars are all aligned. On the left are the 5 ships that come down to the New World, to this river. And down the bottom, a city is developed that has a dome building on top of it. So the Queen said, well, let me pause and think about this for a second. She said, I really don't want to irritate Spain because then they'll come and attack us. But on the other hand, I don't want to become eradicated by Spain. So she took John Dee's advice, and she deeds all of North America to this one guy. His name was Sir Humphrey Gilbert. Gilbert was so appreciative of the work that Dee does, he gives Dee all the lands north of the 50-degree line. That's all Alaska, Canada, and Greenland went to Dee. Dee didn't mind because he got the Northwest Passage, but between Gilbert and Dee, they split up North America. Don't you like people who think big, right? So John Dee draws this map, and he says, look, you don't want to go down to Florida on the southern part. That's where the Spanish are. And you don't want to mess in the Caribbean, but up on the top, way on the northern part, there is this triangular island that Verrazano had talked about that points to this bay that he called Refugio. Here is a close-up of the map. On the left, you see the Hudson River. The triangular island is Block Island in modern terms. And then the bay is Narragansett Bay, the sea that goes northeast. We know all of this because in 1935, a fellow by the name of William Goodman went to the British Records Office and found in the Elizabethan state papers this deed between Sir Humphrey Gilbert and one of the main financiers, Sir George Peckham. I deed you all that river port called by Master John Dee, the Dee River. He names it after himself, this guy Dee. By the description of Verrazano, lies about 42 degrees latitude, mouth open to the south, about 1 mile wide, goes northeast for 24 miles, and then makes a bay 40 miles in circumference in which there are 5 small islands. Perfect description of Narragansett Bay. This has been confirmed by David Beers Quinn and Samuel Eliot Morison, 2 of the greatest writers. They all say the Dee River is Narragansett Bay, no question about that. So what happened, Jim? I know you're wondering. Well, in 1582, the Spanish ambassador who was living in London at the time, Don Bernardino de Mendoza, he had been writing letters back to King Philip of Spain. And Mendoza had a whole group of spies in London. And they told him that within the first few years, there were going to be 10,000 people at this colony in the New World. So he reports to the king that he went to Walsingham, who was the Secretary of State, and Mendoza told him, as soon as we find out where the colony is going to be, that exact location, Spain will go there and slit the throats of every man, woman, and child, just like we did the Rabault colony in Florida, the French colony. And indeed, they massacred everybody. And he also tells the king one more thing, that in 1582, Gilbert and the financiers and Dee were sending out a mission of 2 ships to reconnoiter the place where they can land next year. This mission was under the leadership of Anthony Brigham, and he was one of the best friends of the financiers. And I claim they came here to the New World with these 2 ships and built this tower to be the city center of this first Elizabethan colony in the New World. One of the requirements for the deed was that they build a building and occupy it for a year as a token of occupation. So this was in 1582. The following year, in 1583, the main expedition left with Sir Humphrey Gilbert and 5 ships. They made it as far as St. John's in Newfoundland, and he's quite famous in Canada. Here he is on these stamps in his arrival at St. John's. And in the middle of St. John's is this plaque right on Water Street next to the Sir Humphrey Gilbert Federal Building. It says, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, 1583, took possession of this newfound land for Queen Elizabeth, thereby founding Britain's overseas empire. The birth of the British Empire right there. But he only stayed there for 2 weeks. That's not where he was headed. He was headed here, down here to the Dee River in Newport, where Newport, Rhode Island is today. As he headed down the coast, he hit a hurricane, and Gilbert's ship got swallowed up by a huge wave, and he drowned. The D to North America became void because it was just in his name. The colony came to a grinding halt, the colonization effort. Brigham went back to England and reported to Walsingham, and then they found out that Sir Humphrey Gilbert had died. And so the colonization effort came to a grinding halt. Well, about a year later, the Queen deeds all of North America to Sir Humphrey Gilbert's younger half-brother, who you have heard of. His name is Sir Walter Raleigh, but he decided to go further south to Roanoke Island in North Carolina in 1584, 5, and 7. Those were unsuccessful as well. And then in 1607, you've got the Jamestown colony in Virginia, unsuccessful as well. And then you get the Pilgrims in 1620, and then the Puritans in 1630, the Great Migration in 1640, all to New England. But those guys, all of them missed this tower. That this was it had been left alone, and nobody figured out who owned it until people started settling Narragansett Bay, and this was actually owned by the first governor of Rhode Island. But the architect of this whole plan in the 1500s was John Dee. He was not only the architect of the plan to colonize the New World, he was also the architect of the tower. Now, John Dee wrote over 40 books, and if you read them, he was quite erudite. He talks about architecture, and architecture work must be based on the principles of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and optics. Regarding optics, I mean the lights of heaven are well led in the buildings from certain quarters of the world. That's exactly what Penhallow found in these buildings. The sun, moon, and stars go right through them. There's a guy that's talking about them. Dee's most cherished work was his 1564 Monas Hieroglyphica, which means sacred symbol of oneness. Out of all his 40 books, he liked this the best. And you see he's interested in architecture. And in that egg in the center, you'll see what's called the Monas symbol. And Dee says, he uses it as a rhetorical device in his book. And he says the top part is the moon, the curve of the moon, and then the sun, the solar circle, and then the cross of the elements, fire, air, earth, and water. And down below is the symbol for the first of Aries, the spring equinox, the fire of Aries. He says it's very important you make it exactly these geometrical proportions. But for ornament, you can extend it a little bit, but only if you don't lose the original proportions. So what did the tower originally look like? Well, right now it's 28 feet tall, and I claim it was originally 48 feet tall and had horizontal entablatures and vertical pilasters on it. And the whole thing was plastered over in a technique called sgraffito, that they would plaster something over and then faux paint it to make it look like marble or brick or stone. This is a technique they used all through the Renaissance. You can still see some of the plaster that covers some of the pillars today, but on the rest of the tower it's all worn off. That's why it looks like it's all just stones. And the hidden blueprint for the tower is the Monas symbol. Dee's symbol of proportion is what he used for the proportions of the tower. It's basically the 2-to-1 proportion, or the 2-circle proportion. And the first floor was a camera obscura solar disk sunset room that worked at sunset on the west, and then the second floor was for sunrise, just like Helperic did in 875. And then up on the top would have been a meridiana room where the light would come through a hole in the dome and would read off the time of day and the day of the year. It's a giant horologium, which means a building that keeps track of time. Now, the idea of a horologium goes back to ancient Greece. The Tower of the Winds, which was built by Andronicus around 75 BC, it's all made out of marble, and it was in the center of Athens. It still is. This is my picture. I took it there a couple of years ago. Behind is the Acropolis, and the water would come down this stream, and there was a clepsydra inside, a water clock, drip, drip, drip. It would keep track of time. On the sides were sundials, and up on the top was a weather vane that would mark the weather, the 8 different wind directions. So this is a clock in the center of the town. No, we don't do that anymore. Why? We got cell phones and watches. We don't need that. It seems kind of odd that we put a clock in the middle of town. But Dee's favorite architect, and he tells us this in his book several times, was Vitruvius. He was an architect who lived around 25 BC, and he wrote 10 books on architecture. And he describes the circular temples as the most sacred of all those buildings. And he says they have a central cella, C-E-L-L-A, and a colonnade that goes around, but sometimes they put the columns right on the building. An example of this is Bramante's 1502 Tempietto, which means small temple, which still stands in the middle of Rome today. and Palladio did a drawing of it in 1500s. It was well known, a Vitruvian circular temple. So that's what Dee's tower is. It's a Vitruvian circular temple, but it's a certain type. It's a Renaissance one that incorporated state-of-the-art timekeeping devices, not only inside, but through the windows. And so, to summarize all of this, John Dee was a Renaissance man. He was wise in many subjects. He dreamed of a utopia in the New World, New England. And he was the man who convinced Queen Elizabeth she had a legal right to all of North America. He drew the map, and he chose the site for the first colony. He named it after himself, and I claim he designed this tower to be the first building in the British Empire, which later became the largest empire the world has ever known. By the 1920s, it had circulated the whole world. They said the sun never sets on the British Empire. And as a result, English has become the language of global commerce, and it still is today. So, I claim the idea of America came from the mind of one man, John Dee. He conceived of the British Empire, he coined the term, and he's the reason why I'm speaking to you in English today. And you can go a few blocks away and still see the John Dee Tower of 1583, which still stands in Touro Park, Newport, today. Thank you.